Suicide Note, by Mitchell Heisman. This work is a computer-generated reading of Suicide Note, by Mitchell Heisman. This reading was produced using Natural Reader 14, a product of Natural Soft Limited. This work is free and licensed by Mitchell Heisman for copying and distribution under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivative Works 3.0 United States license. Part 1. God is Technology. How the singularity of monotheism transcended biology and primed the technological genesis of God. Beyond nurture and nature. The oldest trick in the good book. Before the biblical beginning, a classical, static, cyclical conception of cosmic order reigned in the traditional religion of ancient Egypt. Ra, the Egyptian sun god, traveled through the sky during the day, and through the underworld at night. This pattern of eternal repetition was reflected in both the life cycles of individuals, and the cosmos as a whole. Ra was closely allied with Ma'at, the goddess of order and truth. For the pharaoh of Egypt, eternal recurrence of nature's right hierarchical order was supported by the polytheistic hierarchy of Egyptian religion. For Hebrew slaves of Pharaoh, however, the eternity of Egyptian religious social order meant that their life as slaves at the bottom of the cosmic hierarchy was, and should be, eternal. Egyptian religion support Egyptian social hierarchy. Yet even after the Red Sea had been crossed, what were the cosmic implications of eternal recurrence of the same for former slaves of Pharaoh? If history were truly cyclical, this would mean that the escaped Hebrew slaves could look forward to endless, eternal cycles of slavery and freedom. It would mean that after every new exodus of freedom, the Hebrews could expect to look forward to a new bondage. History would consist of alternating cycles of good and evil without end, and without either side claiming ultimate victory. Slavery and exodus, then slavery again, ad nauseum, forever. The entrance of God in history was the entrance of the destroyer of this vicious cycle of primeval civilizational history. The idea of God embodies a break with the past, a break with original conventions or assumption or what is good, natural, and right. God broke the tyranny of the eternal rule of past evil and opened the wider horizons of ultimate good in the future. But did Jews really escape the vicious cycle? The Egyptians, as generalized political oppressors of Jews, inevitably played a role in catalyzing Judaism's breaking of the naturalistic cycle. The idea of creation, and especially the idea of creating something from nothing, hides an origin of Judaism in a reaction to its enemies. This phenomenon, wherein political inferiority is reinterpreted as religious or moral superiority, is the oldest trick in the good book. A socio-biological basis of the cyclical view of the cosmos is idealization of the eternal replication of the selfish gene. The patriarchal family, the means of genetic replication, provided a model for the patriarchal state, Pharaoh, and the gods. The eternity of socio-biological hierarchy thus provided a model for eternal replication of the genes. The one God was like a stake driven through the heart of eternal biological hierarchy. The introduction of God was the introduction of dualism, a conflict between biological impulse and mind/spirit that shattered the even, cyclical momentum of the eternal replication of the selfish gene. God represents an authority superior to the rule of the selfish gene, an authority that ultimately overrules and overrides the closed cyclical cosmos in which the selfish gene rules. God commanded the supernatural veto of the justice of natural selection, the natural justice of death for the weak and survival for the strong. God is the breaking of the vicious cycle that pushes the low lower and raises the strength of the stronger. The rupture of this evil oppressive vicious cycle under the transcendent law of God was the beginning of a non-cyclical or historical view of the cosmos. The Jewish conception of a non-cyclical universe represents a rupture of the primordial, biological cosmos. Freedom from Egyptian slavery is a metaphor for a larger story of freedom, freedom from slavery to genes. Freedom from slavery to the genes could be achieved only through submission to God's post-biological laws. The beginning of the beginning was revolt against slavery to the genes. This is why the Mosaic Revolution was all of one piece, a singular, monotheistic vision of transcending the human cycles ruled by the laws of the genes. This is what explains the universalism of the biblical epic. Breaking the cycle that led from Exodus back to slavery, or worse, was accomplished through acceptance of the divine laws that elevated the chosen people above naturalistic, gene-worshipping, socio-biological determinism. This was the beginning, the creation of a transcendent historical platform from which the final transcendence was anticipated, the coming of the Messianic era and the end of the vicious cycles of human history. While the Jewish yearly calendar is as cyclical as any other, holidays such as Passover celebrate the counter-cycle of the Exodus paradigm. So even as the yearly cycle generates a natural rhythm, annual holidays celebrate the breaking of a natural rhythm. The paradox of a yearly cycle of holidays oriented by the counter-cycle paradigm of Exodus is reflected in the paradox of Jews as biological beings with characteristic post-biological values. The modern idea of revolution, strongly influenced by Bible because, was stuck in the same paradox, unable to completely disown biology. For the Hebrew slaves of the Exodus story, a cyclical cosmos implied a repeating pattern of good and evil in which one side never ultimately triumphed over the other. The Egyptian cosmos could not account for slaves that escaped the cosmic system. But to completely break out of the cyclical conception of the cosmos in the cause of life over death was to posit an end goal of history. The Exodus paradigm of evil slavery followed by the good of freedom in God would be writ large. A directional conception of history would culminate in the ultimate, messianic triumph of good over evil. Instead of the eternal recurrence of repression, the theory went, the ultimate pattern of human history would begin from the trough of Egyptian slavery and peak with the coming of the messianic era. In this idea, alien to the ancient Greeks but central for 17th century Puritans, one can discern the seed of the modern idea of progress. The biblical value that breaks the cyclical logic of genetic continuity is infinite valuation of each individual life in the eyes of God. The transcendent relationship between God and individuals means that relationships between people, especially kinship or familial relationships, can be overridden by an individual's relationship with God. This break in the relationship between an individual and all other humans, taken to its extreme, implies a break in the continuity of biological relationships that subordinate an individual to the selfish genes. Moral individualism or conscience acts as a monkey wrench in the cyclical universe of subordination to the reproduction of the selfish gene. Patriarchal division of labor is conducive to selfish gene reproduction because women are subordinated to their primary role as biological beings, breeders of more selfish genes. Polysociobiological development of this kind culminates in the worship of patriarchal gods, i.e. Pharaoh or Caesar Augustus. The model, however, is premised on a reasonable straightforward development of kin selection. The Jewish kinship paradox meant that this entire model was utterly improbable, if not impossible, for Jews. The Jewish kinship paradox meant that pure socio-biological naturalism was self-defeating. To survive, Jews could only rest their faith in the post-biological corrective of Mosaic law. To survive, Jews could only look forward from the premise of the goodness of overcoming pure biological naturalism. There was no going back to nature, and this led the evolution of the Bible towards prophetic speculations about the full implications of overcoming biology in God. The modern Western political left evolved as a direct extension of this original biblical revolt against biology. The internal logic of the modern idea of progress originates in a valuation of an exception to general socio-biological rules. For example, if the ancient Egyptians believed that Egyptians were born superiors and their slaves were born inferiors, the hereditary nature of these assumed socio-biological rules had a tendency to harden into eternal dictates. This may have been a political generalization of ancient Egyptian experience, but could it be assumed universally true? The Jewish ideas of the Exodus paradigm began to capitalize on the power of memes to overpower genes, and especially the power of memes to amplify the point of view of the exception to socio-biological rules. A result is another paradox. The Adamic human universalism of the Hebrew Bible is a product of Jews being an exception to the general biological emphasis of the human rule. Jews were exceptional in using a meme strategy that magnified their influence by bringing marginal views to the mainstream. Jewish human universalism began with an exceptional emphasis on using non-biological means to overcome biology. The Egyptian pharaoh Akhenaten is often considered an exception to the general rule of Egyptian polytheism. His famous vaulting of the worship of the sun god Aten to undisputed primacy is often considered a form of monotheism. Pointing out the simple, bare analogy of Akhenaten's single god and Mosaic monotheism, however, does not even begin to account for the whole corpus of Mosaic law or its ethical substance. While I refer to Moses in paradigmatic terms, the lack of historical evidence for both Moses and the Exodus are among the most basic reasons that Freud's speculations on this subject are groundless. Is there, then, any relationship between Akhenaten and biblical monotheism? While I frankly do not think there is a historic connection, if there was a connection, it would likely be one of dialectics, not continuity. Consider, for example, the general form of the relationship between Caesar and Christ. Caesar Augustus was considered Son of God in his day. Jesus claimed the same title for himself, subverting Caesar's claims to the highest authority. The same dialectical pattern is vaguely discernible in the relationship between a pharaoh such as Akhenaten and storybook Egyptian slaves. Or, to venture even more speculative musings, perhaps in staring into the sun, Akhenaten was the first to stare into the singularity.